Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar Future of Diplomacy After COVID-19. On behalf of the United Nations Secretariat, particularly the United Nations Academic Impact, we are very pleased that you have decided to join us today for this event. As a housekeeping rule, we kindly ask you to turn off the cameras and the mics during the whole duration of the event, unless you are an invited speakers, in order to conserve bandwidth and not to interrupt those who are taking the floor. As stated in our invitation to this event, this webinar will examine recent developments, ongoing challenges, and new perspective of multilateral diplomacy within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how this framework can and will, in fact, change the work within international organizations such as this one, the United Nations. The event will also highlight the critical relevance of multilateral diplomacy to address global problems through global solutions. I think we can all agree that this particular context of the pandemic, since it started earlier last year, have changed dramatically, has shaped dramatically the way we conduct business, particularly when it comes to diplomacy, and also has brought to the light and to the attention of the international community what role the United Nations and international organizations in general should have in addressing problems not only related to particularly health, but also to poverty, finance, economic, and so on. And I think we have all been affected somehow, one way or another, by the pandemic, and particularly the panelists that we are going to hear today are people that work directly in or within United Nations premises, either as members of the United Nations staff or as diplomats representing their own countries in the compounds in the arena of international diplomacy. So it is a privilege for us to have you here. For those of you who do not know that much about UNAI, UNAI, the United Nations Academic Impact, is an initiative that aligns institutions of higher education with the United Nations, particularly to promote and foster the goals, principles, and ideals enshrined in the United Nations Charter. And this is a document that is particularly relevant for this webinar because this is just 2 days before the anniversary of the signing of the United Nations Charter that took place in San Francisco here in the United States in 1945 on 26 June. So we want to celebrate 2 days ahead UN Charter Day to revisit the Charter, to revisit the idea behind the United Nations, to revisit the idea behind multilateral diplomacy. Certainly, multilateral diplomacy was not born with the United Nations, but the United Nations, when it was founded and established, and so many decades after its founding, we have to revisit, we have to review, to examine what role should the United Nations play in today's world, particularly considering the challenges and problems ahead of us. So it is a particularly timely discussion to have. We are going to hear presentations from the distinguished panelists, and it happens that all these panelists have come together not only for this webinar, but also for the publication of a book that its title is pretty much the same as the title of this webinar. So we kindly invite you after to see and to read this book that I happen to have the privilege and distinct honor to receive a copy of that book, and which is why, and this is the rationale and background for the organization of this particular virtual event. Once we hear the presentations from the different speakers, then we are going to have a Q&A session. The attendees we kindly ask them again not to turn on their cameras and mic, but if you want to make a comment or to make a question, please do so through the chat box available in this platform. So we're going to proceed to hear our very first speaker, Ms. Hannah Al-Hashimi. She's a member of the UN Secretary General's Internet Governance Forum Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group. She's also a former senior advisor in the Office of the President of the United Nations General Assembly and former Sustainable Development and Digital Cooperation expert at the Permanent Mission of the United Arab Emirates to the United Nations. So, Mrs. Al-Hashimi, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Omar. Muchas gracias, and greetings to everyone on the call. It's such a pleasure to join you today, and thank you so very much. And what an honor to come together as we're marking 76 years from the signing of the Charter of the United Nations in San Francisco, and that dream of global cooperation that has inspired many of us to go into careers around the United Nations and to support international cooperation overall. Indeed, all of us, thank you for the warm welcome. This really, it's a pleasure for us to come together as multilateralists, as international cooperation enthusiasts, and to talk about our views that culminated in a book project that we worked on together through the pandemic. That really sought to tease out some of the lessons learned, or the lessons that we could learn in this great disruptor, for lack of a better term, for all processes. I know that our audience has many members of the academic community with it, as well as practitioners, experts from across this field, and it's so great to be able to exchange with you. We very much look forward to your views on this topic. But what we were hoping to do together, in writing in our personal capacities and building on our own experiences from our various fields, ranging from security to economic development, digital cooperation, and health, as well as the rule of law, was to really provide a practitioner's guide for the new diplomacy, a perspective of negotiators, given that all of us have worked in creating the architectures for sustainable development, including the Sustainable Development Goals, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and various other ones. And then second, providing a developing country perspective. All of us come essentially from countries of the South and have represented governments of the South. And bringing that perspective of the in the 3 pillars of the United Nations, including the development, peace and security, and human rights architecture. The third was to provide a timely consideration of lessons learned from the middle of the crisis as it was developed. Looking at the lessons and how we can understand through the disruptions how to future-proof each of these areas, and focusing on the timeline of March to October last year. And then finally, the fourth objective that we had was certainly to focus on the future and inject some pragmatism and guidance to facilitate efforts to build back better in COVID response plans, while creating a space for continued focus on global commitments around sustainable development and the future of the United Nations towards, of course, the 100th anniversary in 2045. And we very much look forward to engaging with all of you towards that 100th anniversary and centennial of the United Nations. So to give you, I think Omar has set the stage quite well, and we all, I think, agree that just as COVID hit, really we were looking at a little bit of a crisis of multilateralism. And we found that COVID really amplified existing concerns, existing trends, and existing really calls for reform and development and advancement of the international system. So whereas all of us agreed that you needed to have strong international global cooperation to both mitigate the spread of the virus and to ensure a smooth mobilization of vaccines around the world. There was a sense that the political leadership needed was slow to mobilize and lacked perhaps the leadership at the highest levels. And of course, that resulted in a tragic loss of life due to overwhelmed healthcare systems. Of course, we're looking at least 4 years until we start to see socioeconomic recovery. And as we marked UN Day on the 24th of October last year, we also marked 42 million COVID cases, 1.1 million deaths, millions of jobs lost, 1.6 billion children having their school and education disrupted, and a disproportionate impact, of course, on the most vulnerable. Having said that, where we saw hope was really in the fact that we already had a roadmap available. The Sustainable Development Goals, which my dear colleague Tony Shea will elaborate more on, already put in place the roadmap that we needed to build back better, and really re-emphasized the focus that we need to have in the decade of action on those Sustainable Development Goals. So through the book, we're looking at challenges, the opportunities, and future prospects of the international diplomatic system. I'd also want to include some inputs for our colleague Nabil, who unfortunately can't be with us today, where he basically outlines some of the disruptions that we saw as practitioners in the middle of the crisis, and that's at 3 levels. Of course, at the global level. Ultimately, COVID affected our ability to actually do the work of international diplomacy. So, of course, meetings came to a standstill. Colleagues will go into more details on this, but basically our ability, apart from the actual meetings, our ability to actually implement the international architectures for sustainable development, ensuring the access to food, ensure the access to education around the world, and the work of the UN system, and how that happens globally. Really, there was absolutely disruptions that we see in each of these sectors that my colleagues will elaborate on. And a need to focus more on health. At the national level, of course, foreign ministries' priorities were completely shifted to dealing and trying to support nationals that were abroad, trying to deal with border closures and how to protect citizens who need to return in the absence of commercial flights, how to deal with socioeconomic impacts, and in some regions, particularly in Africa, the socioeconomic impacts were much higher than the health impacts initially, for sure. There were, of course, new mandates given to ministries, and essentially completely different ideas of how to work with budgets, staff rotations, travel, etc. And at the individual level, of course, in terms of the work of diplomats, as well as international servants, nonprofit workers, and really all of us, the lack of day-to-day interaction, the need to continuously distance, made in-person meetings completely not feasible. So the idea of lobbying for anything, of holding receptions, building bridges, having corridor conversations, trying to negotiate informally on language, and doing really the informal diplomatic work, which we realized was the majority of the switching to a virtual platform proved to have its limits. So there were some, and the book goes through some of the solutions that were found, one of which was coming up with a new silence procedure method through which it was possible to adopt 70 resolutions through last year, and 2 of them focusing particularly on COVID-19, particularly one on global solidarity to fight the disease, and another one on international cooperation to ensure global access to medicine, vaccines, and medical equipment in order to face COVID-19. I'd also, in the remaining time that I have left, also like to touch a little bit on my chapter then, which looks at the technological side of this, and also at another element that I think is important, which is that of stakeholder diplomacy. So of course, 76 years ago, the UN was set up as a platform based on the Westphalian state system for multilateral government-to-government interaction. However, the charter in itself speaks of we the peoples, and the need for all peoples to be represented. And so the effective and the impactful engagement of other stakeholders from the private sector, from civil society, from academia, and from governments at every level, is something that has continuously come up as an area that's important for the future of multilateralism and for how the UN is able to deliver its role. On the technology side, of course, the reality is that the creators of technology, the users of technology, and the regulators thereof are not necessarily in sync in terms of their timelines. The question of coming up with international public policy that actually is possible at internet speed is something that's absolutely at the top at the moment of policymakers' agendas, in that it's not something that's been solved necessarily. But it's very interesting to see because the parallels with the pandemic, because the pandemic also required the rapid development of solutions, of policy making, and really accelerating how we come up with solutions globally in order to deal with the speed of the virus spread. So hopefully there's some more parallels that can be drawn and implications for policymaking in the space moving forward. I think something that the two have in common, technologies, of course, and digital technologies and the pandemic, is that they catalyze both the positive and negative trends. And they both very much depend on multilateralism in order to enable more of the positive. Having said that, I think there's a few things that we have to keep in mind. One is that half of the world still remains offline. We have seen leaps and bounds of progress through the pandemic to connect all, so that we can continue with learning, livelihoods, and really save lives. However, it's of course everyone agrees that it's no longer acceptable for half the world to remain offline, and for women to be the majority of those that are offline, such that, for example, if you're a woman in South Asia, you're 58% less likely to be an internet user than a man. And we also have to look, of course, at the multidimensional aspects of access, including reliability, affordability, the relevance, and connectivity. There are, of course, new trends that have come up, of course, through the pandemic, through social tracing, contact tracing apps, through other developments, where people are starting to question the right to privacy in the digital age, how long these emergency measures will stay in place, and really what this means in the context of a big data bang, where we're looking at the Internet of Things, and we're looking at how we had 2 billion objects connected to the Internet in 2006, and we've mushroomed to 200 billion by the end of 2020. And we know that the risks are amplified just as technologies develop, and we've seen that already in 2017, when you had baby monitors that were hacked and completely took down the California electricity grid, such that even in developed countries, you had this issue. And then on the governance side, I think it's important to come back to this point of stakeholder diplomacy, of how you can bring non-state actors together with diplomats on matters of governance in an increasingly interdependent world. And one such platform to do that is, of course, the Internet Governance Forum, which was created as a multi-stakeholder platform for dialogue, which has a number of measures in which to start to solve challenges and share best practices from around the world. Another platform really to move this conversation forward, developed through the pandemic impressively, led by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who had previously assigned a high-level panel for digital cooperation to look to recommendations on how to start to develop internet governance measures at internet speed. And this resulted in the laying out of a roadmap for digital cooperation, where you had dozens of countries and stakeholders working together to see how they could address every aspect of this, from the access issue, the development issues, capacity building issues, privacy issues, security issues, and the overall governance architecture. So really where we land on here is three key recommendations, which is first putting people at the center of the future that we want. So when we're looking at technology governance, we have to ensure that nobody is left behind, and that we're including voices from all around the world, but putting really people-centered development and well-being at the heart of our policies. The second is ensuring the primacy of access and governance and capacity building, again, focusing on developing countries. And the third is looking at technology governance and the possibilities for agile international governance overall, and the future of multilateralism overall. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Al-Hashimi, for your perspective and for highlighting one critical factor People in the north tend to assume that because we are all telecommuting and using virtual modes of communication and learning and teaching, of course, everybody has access to ICTs and to reliable internet connections and to hardware and software that is properly needed to do that. And actually, the digital gap is a very severe and grave challenge, particularly in the global south. So we thank you very much for pointing that out. It is now my pleasure to turn on to Mr. Andrés Fiallo. He is the first secretary of the permanent mission of Ecuador to the United Nations, former senior political advisor to the president of the UN General Assembly, and former director of international relations at the Ministry of National Defense of Ecuador. Andrés, tiene la palabra.
Muchas gracias, querido Mar. Thank you very much. And thank you also very much to my dear friend and colleague, Hannah Al-Hashimi, for her introduction and presentation of her chapter. Normally, I like when she speaks on her chapter after me, because you'll see that one of my conclusions, and let me start with that, is that one of the key dimensions of the future of peace and security diplomacy is digital cooperation. Theodore Mar, thank you again. I will mention some elements that are in my chapter in the book, but I also like to make some reference to the context which we are in due to the upcoming celebration of the UN Charter in a couple of days. Well, the pandemic affected the diplomacy roadmap around the world. The agenda of international organizations was disrupted. The COVID-19 virus impacted on the DNA of diplomacy, namely close human contact between peers, personal interaction, room and corridors and cafe negotiations. And the pandemic largely shifted the field of diplomacy from the conference room to virtual connections. Initially, last year, much was said and written about the end of diplomacy. The error there consists in considering diplomacy as a mere channel of communication, as a teller of messages, when in reality, in fact, diplomacy is more a negotiator of realities, a builder of realities. Kissinger defined diplomacy as the art of relating between states by agreement and not by force. Others consider diplomacy as the method of influencing foreign governments by peaceful means and not by war. So when you see that, you know that in the DNA of diplomacy, peaceful means are part of it, but also the goal of peace itself. And with this, peace and security will continue being central in the future of diplomacy. In chapter 5, we depart from the notion of COVID-19 as a force multiplier for all aspects of diplomacy. Sustaining peace is also an essential lens in our chapter, and I think also in our book, where peace is not only the absence of disturbance and the absence of war, but rather the presence of justice, freedom, and development. The book, as I mentioned, looks at many elements, but due to the time, I'm going to refer only at this stage to two central questions. First, the question if the United Nations were ready before the pandemic, and two, what do we need to be future ready? So was the UN ready before the pandemic? Okay, 17 years ago, the United Nations was already addressing the global vulnerability to new infectious diseases. The 2004 report of the High-Level Panel on Threats, Challenge and Change, created by former Secretary General Kofi Annan, addressed already the international security threats posed by the potential natural outbreak of an infectious disease. In its conclusions, it prescribed the interaction needed between the WHO Director General and the Security Council. When you come 17 years later to those recommendations, you know that the Security Council took 4 months to adopt Resolution 2532 on the global, in support of the global ceasefire, but also in support of the efforts on peace and on the to counter the effects of the COVID-19. So when you look at that, there is a very huge gap between those recommendations from 17 years ago and what actually happened last year. Indeed, we are about on the 1st of July, we're going to commemorate the first year of the adoption of that resolution. And I want to mention that because we were quarantined, we were not able to come to the headquarters. So also that affected in a way the work of member states. So what happened 1 week before the adoption of Resolution 2532, a number of member states, 172 actually, we came together with a joint declaration whose anniversary was actually yesterday, first year of anniversary. We came together to call on the international community on the Security Council also to act. So these joint declarations became also a very common tool of the work of diplomats during the social distancing measures in the city. I'll go now to my second question: what do we need to be future ready? Well, in the book you will see that we consider the need for preventive diplomacy to be strengthened, culture of peace. A more equitable world order also is in the hands of our leaders, in the hands of our head of states and government. We need to have the human being at the center. People need also to put pressure through democratic means on their own governments to halt arms expenditures, in particular nuclear weapons. And we can, I can also address these in the question and answer segment, specific elements on the budgets that are actually still ongoing in armament. I started my presentation with one of my conclusions, which is we don't have certainty of what the peace and security will look like in 2 or 3 or 4 years, but we do have certainty that digital cooperation is going to be fundamental in shaping a more positive world in this specific domain. So I thank you very much all for your attention.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Andres, for your participation. It is indeed a pleasure for us to have you here and to connect again with the work as your colleague Hannah explained the new dynamics around the work at the UN. I must inform our audience though that as per Secretary General's letter to the staff, we are going back to the office hopefully within the next few days on 6 July. And so probably things are going to change a little bit. I'm still unaware of how the upcoming General Assembly session will be conducted, but certainly I have the feeling that it will not be entirely virtual. So, but we will see what happens with that. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Mrs. Mona Ali Khalil. She's the director of MAC Law International Strategic Consultant Service. She's an affiliate of the Harvard Law School Program on International Law and Armed Conflict, and former senior legal advice officer in the United Nations Office of the Legal Counsel. Mrs. Ali Khalil, you have the floor. Thank you very much. You are muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having us and hosting us today, Omar. And it's a pleasure to be with my co-authors again on this occasion, especially as we are approaching the anniversary of the adoption of the United Nations Charter. This is a key moment, a turning point, as some have called it, a wake-up call, as the Secretary General has called it, in the life of the organization and a true test of its fitness for the coming period as we plan now for the centennial, just as we embark on the end of the 75th anniversary. So Dag Hammarskjöld once said that the UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but rather to save it from hell. If member states live up to the promises they made in the UN 75 Declaration, adopted last fall, not only in word, but also in deed, the wake-up call provided by the pandemic can indeed serve as a turning point. Hannah spoke of a crisis of multilateralism, predating the pandemic. The pandemic did not as much aggravate that crisis as it did expose the dangers of that crisis. But as horrible as the last year has been, it is a far cry from the horrors of the 1918 pandemic and the aftermath thereof. Today, we've lost somewhere between 3.5 and 4 million lives. As horrible as that toll is, it is a fraction of the 50 million lives lost to the Spanish flu in 1918 and 1919. They too were under lockdown for the most part of 2 years, in their homes, wearing masks, socially distancing, many of the same methods that we've adopted 100 years later. Is that to say that there's been no progress? Quite the contrary. They had to do what we've been doing without the benefit of smartphones and Zoom calls and Teams conferences, and without the benefit of Netflix and the means to conduct work from home and school from home. They could not even call their families and friends to check whether they were dead or alive. So we should be grateful for the blessings of technology and industrialization, as well as the various advances that have been possible in the medical and other scientific fields. The digital and other technologies that bridge the chasm and connect the world today did not exist in 1918. The medical advances that make vaccines
excuse me,
possible.
Monica, can everybody please turn off their mics and cameras? Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. The medical advances that have brought us vaccines in record time were also not possible at the time. The organizations that make up the UN system and the supply chain of public and private sector actors that make delivery of the treatments and vaccines possible to every corner in the world also did not exist. So we look back at the last century and forget the millions who died in the pandemic, but celebrate the medical, technological, and digital revolutions. We forget the demise of the League of Nations and celebrate the establishment of the UN. We forget the millions of innocents killed in the Holocaust and other genocides of the 20th century and celebrate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Too many in the world today still do not have access to technology or to vaccines or to international assistance. So like the founding fathers who emerged from World War II and adopted the UN Charter to offer a way out of war and genocide, and towards peace and security, socio-economic advancement, self-determination of peoples, we should also act not out of idealism alone, but rather out of self-preservation. For 75 years later, we have not had another war, another world war, but we are facing numerous intrastate conflicts, multiple genocides, a global terrorist threat, an accelerating climate crisis, and yet another global pandemic. We have not done very well from the beginning of the 21st century. We've had the 9/11 terrorist attacks, US-UK aggression in Iraq, Russian aggression in Ukraine, the use of chemical weapons prohibited since 1925, and other mass atrocities in Syria, genocides in Darfur, Myanmar, and elsewhere, and the unparalleled savagery of ISIS and other terrorist groups affiliated with it. In March 2020, we learned that it can get even worse than that mass death can come from the spread of a virus, not just the proliferation of WMD. We learned that we need the Council to meet, to convene, and to adopt resolutions, not only by consensus, but by vote if necessary. We learned that the General Assembly can step up when the Security Council is failing or flailing. So when the Council took 4 months to adopt a resolution, paralyzed by the fissures between the US and China, with the WHO getting caught in the crossfire, the UN General Assembly stepped up with several resolutions indicating the solidarity of the membership. They could have invoked Uniting for Peace to adopt collective measures rather than mere recommendations. The Secretary General also answered the call. In a rare show of proactive leadership, he called for a global ceasefire to facilitate humanitarian assistance. With the help of the elected 10 of the Security Council, he got that initiative adopted. but wouldn't have been even greater if the Security Council recognized that it has a responsibility, a duty to prevent, not just to respond. If the General Assembly revitalized its emergency special powers and acted in this emergency situation, if the Secretary General invoked Article 99 of the UN Charter and made concrete recommendations regarding the response to the pandemic, as well as the humanitarian access during the pandemic. So the UN has an opportunity to live up to its founder's vision of harmonizing the actions of nations, not just to respond to threats, but to prevent them, not just to heal the people, but also heal the planet. We have an opportunity to protect civilians from terrorism, nations from aggression, peoples from genocide, and the planet from climate change. The tools to do so are in the Charter and in existing resolutions and existing mechanisms. We can do it, and I hope we do, for the sake of the peoples of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mona, for your insights, and to remind us that this is not certainly the first challenge that neither the UN nor we as an international community face. Indeed, we have observed and witnessed a number of challenges and problems, but I am confident enough to say that probably this is one of the most complex ones because it encompasses a wide range of issues and problems. But thank you very much indeed for that. It is now my pleasure to introduce Mrs. Toni Shea Freckleton. She is the team leader for sustainable development in the Office of the President of the UN General Assembly and former Director of Population and Health at the Planning Institute of Jamaica. Mr. Freckleton, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Omar, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us and the distinguished colleagues that are here to hear from us on our publication and the views that we have to offer and to share. On my part, the chapter on the future of sustainable development really presented an assessment of the impact of COVID on the sustainable development landscape and its implications in the short, medium, and long term. It also recognized 2020, when we were in the heart of the COVID-19 pandemic, also as the period where we launched the decade of action on delivery and on the SDGs. And importantly, it also was the period where we had a very perfect snapshot of the progress of the first 4 years of implementation of the 2030 agenda. At the end or during 2020, we saw that around about 140 or so countries had presented what was called then their voluntary national reviews, reporting mixed progress across countries in their implementation of the 2030 agenda. It showed that progress on several SDGs were slow and that the global response really had been insufficient to protect the most vulnerable people and countries. Considerable efforts, though, were made by various actors to rally efforts towards, this very comprehensive and far-reaching agenda. Certainly for governments, there was very strong evidence that governments were now integrating the SDGs in their national planning, policymaking, and reporting. For the UN system itself, the UN was undertaking its most deepest reform in decades. And the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic was really the first true test of this reform of the UN development system and how they would deliver for countries on the SDGs. Stakeholder groups, including youth and also many of you here in academia, really had spurred action, very strong action, and presented forward entry points to advance progress on the goals. So what we had seen is that the social and economic consequences of the pandemic varied from one region to the next and from one country to the next, affecting people, their health and well-being, and also threatening human rights. So by the end of June 2020, as my colleague Hannah outlined, we were seeing the implications of COVID-19 on the SDGs, which painted really a very grim and gloomy picture, many of the impacts she has outlined, but just to add that it pushed just over 71 million more people back into poverty. Of course, a global health emergency. Several countries were plunged into economic recession, with some also experiencing debt distress. And that is something, you know, going forward in the future, from a sustainable development perspective, we will have to address. And my colleague, Jonathan, who will speak next, will look at some of these issues. And disproportionately, it affected the most vulnerable people: women, children, older persons, persons with disabilities, migrants and refugees. And from a group of country perspective, LDCs, those are least developed countries, landlocked developed countries, small island developed states, and developing states and middle income countries were particularly vulnerable to the external shocks, which, you know, severely hampered their already fragile macroeconomic landscape. So as I mentioned, COVID-19 was a test of the 2030 agenda. It exposed the global ill-preparedness for external shocks, but importantly, it also triggered a level of urgent and global action on sustainable development beyond what was originally envisaged when the 2030 agenda was adopted in 2015. So as Mona and Andres and Anna, you know, outlined, the world is currently being challenged by multiple crises, but countries are now positioned to reset their priorities and to tackle some of the most pressing issues. And even though we all come from different developing countries, from one developing country to the next, those priorities and pressing challenges may vary. Moving forward, you know, I think for policymakers, sustainable development practitioners, or civil society partners, academia, and the private sector will now have to work together to adapt to the new realities in response to the COVID-19. And I share just a few perspectives on how the mega trends of the changing population dynamics and demographics and rapid technological advancement, as Hannah addressed, are changing how we see sustainable development, looking at how we will be required to focus more investment in our human capital to bridge not only the inequality divide, but the gender and the digital divides in what has been called in the chapter the, you know, an inequality dilemma. It also forces us to put a greater risk perspective to development planning, where we have to focus now on risk resilience at all levels, including at the household level as well. It's also an opportunity to ensure that we have a green recovery and to facilitate greater climate resilience. And of course, strengthening the science policy interface to forecast and to better prepare for new challenges. So from the book, The Future of Sustainable Development, which is very key to multilateralism, is hinged on these few points that I want to share. We're going to see an evolution towards more horizontal sharing and network thinking, a whole of society approach where we're bringing together all actors as agents of change in what we see as a very complex multidimensional system. We're seeing that there's a great insufficiency in siloed approaches to how we respond to shocks and crises. And it recognizes that we have to focus on complex global system approaches in our responses. And as a result of that, the tools, particularly for those in the audience as academia, the tools, the systems, and the capacities to approach development has to be interconnected. And I want to also draw your attention to the SDG Acceleration Toolkit, which was recently launched by UNDP to address the kinds of integrated solutions that will be needed for sustainable development. Also, crisis presents opportunities for possibilities and change. And as Andres said, it takes us now towards a more future-focused multilateral development system. Making the point again, because I think for me and my colleagues keep hearing me say this, the future of sustainable development is going to be about resilience. So risk-informed governance and planning, building resilient systems, institutions, and even mindset and choices to help our people in the world to thrive in a more sustainable way. And of course, data, the science policy interface. We already know that, you know, the COVID pandemic has really provided us with opportunities for collecting new statistics, new kinds of data, and to investing more into the production of high quality official statistics to inform our decisions and policy response, because what gets measured gets prioritized for action, it gets financed, and there we can assess impact. So I wanted to just close that for us moving forward with the 2030 agenda, a very critical moment is in 2023, when we will have the next global stock take on the 2030 agenda. And therefore, the decisions that we make now in the recovery for the COVID-19 pandemic will inform how or response and or progress in the 2030 agenda. So the disruptions from COVID has really given us new meaning to resilience, and this has to be manifested at all levels: the individual, the community, institutions, national and global levels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Freckleton, for your remarks and for underlining the importance of data. And data is particularly relevant because some years ago, 2030 used to be seen as something very far away in distance, but in reality, it's just a few years ahead. And we must remember that the Secretary General of the United Nations launched last year the Decade of Action for the SDGs. And the reason for that, and that particular name for the decade, is that I think the time to discuss and reflect on the SDGs has elapsed. It is time now to actually make plausible, concrete, real actions and to propose real solutions that benefit the people in the field around the world, but particularly in the countries that are very far away from actually achieving a number of targets within the SDGs. So thank you very much, Mr. Freckleton, for your remarks. And now, finally, last but not least, we have Mr. Jonathan Vieira. He's the first Secretary of the Permanent Mission of Ecuador to the United Nations, former Senior Advisor on Economics and Financing for Development in the Office of the President of the UN General Assembly, and former Lecturer of Economics at Fairleigh Dickinson University here in the United States and at the University of the Americas in Ecuador. Jonathan, tiene la palabra. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Omar. Gracias for this invitation, and good morning, everybody. For me, it's an honor to be part of this event. At the beginning of this project, we were discovering COVID-19. Its economic effects were unknown, and many experts were optimistic and predicted that the effects of the pandemic would overcome in 2021. And other pessimists predicted a strong setback in the economy. Unfortunately, the most pessimistic were closer to the reality we live today, more than 1 year after the beginning of the pandemic. As for people, the pandemic has been a disease that affected the global economy, as there are persistences, symptoms, prescriptions, side effects, strains, medicines, among other analogies. One of the conclusions on the chapter in economics is related with the prescription. In general, there is already a consensus on prescribing the economic measures to be taken to rescue countries from an economic crisis. The debate should focus in the implementation. In fact, during the 2008 crisis, member states decided to organize a UN conference on the world financial and economic crisis and its impact on development. As a result of the conference, member states committed themselves to collaborate and provide a global and coordinated response to the crisis, and agreed to adopt measures that could be applied today in 2021. For example, providing sufficient support to developing countries to cope with the social effects of the crisis, ensuring the long-term debt sustainability of developing countries, promoting and revitalizing trade and investment, in strengthening the role of the UN in responding the economic crisis, and reforming the international financial and economic architecture to adapt to crisis challenges. Another conclusion is related with the persistences. Before COVID-19 and although the roadmaps, the global economy in the context of financing for development was sick with severe systematic problems, which caused a great infection in the global economy. As we know, 2015 was an historic year for multilateralism and its development agendas. It was a very intensive time for those of us negotiating such agendas in 2015 for some reasons. First, we were creating a holistic agendas incorporating several politic visions and perspectives in almost a surgical balance. And second, the 2030 agenda and the Addis Ababa action agenda had to be consistent with each other, while remaining autonomous, which required complex coordination between negotiations groups of states here in New York or respective capitals, among other challenges, including a lot of coffee. After that, and up until 2019, the global economy had shown some stability without significant progress in the financing for development arena and its roadmaps. The high-level dialogue on financing for development in 2019 showed the same systematic vulnerabilities of debt levels, financial volatility, fiscal space, illicit financial flows, and world trade. Those systematic vulnerabilities were complicated the progress of the SDG, as Tony Shea mentioned. The chapter on economies is focused in three areas: international trade, debt, and decent work. How the pandemic affect those areas. Statistics shows that international trade landscape was marked for an individual trade measures, and already weakened WTO was not in position to offer global solution to global problems. Why? Because as other economics indicators addresses in the book, world trade was already decreasing before COVID-19 outbreak. This was due to the progressive accumulation of trade barriers since 2018, and its effects dominated in highly interconnected global value chains. Although was not a coordinated and global response to the pandemic, world trade was less sensitive to change in the global GDP than other areas in the economy. Regarding with debt, the situation was and is critical now. For many developing countries, the pandemic represents the perfect storm, encapsulating and deteriorating long-standing fiscal situation, and additional needs for spending and collapsed incomes. This was particularly the case in countries depend on commodities exports or imports, such as those relying highly the tourism industry. In the actions and recommendations of the chapter, I have to say that economic and the financial situations are heterogeneous and requiring tailor-made solutions that consider countries' diverse vulnerabilities. But there is only one medicine that may be administered generally: leadership and political decision. For a fiscal therapy in developing countries, is imperative debt service relief. Debt service payments have largely been suspended to provide the most vulnerable countries with the necessary fiscal space to respond to the crisis without affecting their credit ratings and providing them with its better credit lines in the medium term. The future of work demands countries create synergies with private sector partners and educational institutions to minimize the negative effects of this phenomenon. 133 million new roles may emerge more adapted to the new division labor between humans, machines, and algorithms. And finally, environmental and climate action may provide new jobs opportunities when moving towards green economy. Although green economies can cause job losses in carbon-intensive industries, according to the ILO, this will be offset by creation of 24 million new jobs worldwide by 2030. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Jonathan. Thank you very much for your remarks. And to give us some pessimistic overview of the ongoing pandemic, indeed, it has caused tremendous challenges, but also there are opportunities there. And if we are to recover, it needs to be, we cannot go back to the way we used to be. So the new normal cannot be the old normal. It has to be a new one. And so we have to rethink and reconsider things and perhaps make a more sustainable normal, a more sustainable reality. And I think the role of multilateral diplomacy in this sense is quite important. Allow me to proceed to the interactive session. And before we do that, just as a reminder to our audience, please turn off your mics and cameras, but also if you would like to ask a question or to make a comment to our distinguished panelists, please do so via the chat box. If you were to this is a question for all the speakers. If you were to say in just one sentence, why the UN is important right now, considering the challenges that we have seen and the ones you have spoke about, what would you say on that? Whoever would like to take the floor. Yes, Mrs. Al-Hashimi.
Thank you so very much, Omar. What a fantastic question to start on. And really, I'm always inspired after hearing my colleagues. I think the reason the UN is so important is the one word would be representation. It is the only place where you have over 7 billion people around the world represented. It is highly relevant in that representation role and in the need to consider global challenges and as a platform for a global cooperation. Maybe.
Thank you. I saw Mona raise her hand. Mona, you have the floor.
Thank you, Omar. I think it's a duty that the UN and the member states of the UN owe to the we the peoples. The charter isn't written we the governments or we the states or we the nations. It's we the peoples. And despite its many failures, the UN is still the place that people turn to when they are suffering war, when they are suffering poverty, when they are suffering any kind of fear or threat. They turn to the UN for the solution. So we owe them to be fit to respond to that calling.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Thank you, Mar. As you said, now we have a global problem. And I think that the only way to face the global problems is with the global solutions. And there is only one room in the world where we could design that solutions, and it is United Nations.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Indeed, if we read, I mean, some of us have read extensively the UN Charter for professional and academic reasons. If we go to the purposes of the UN, which is basically the reason why the UN was founded in the first place, we see, well, there are a number of things that first, peace, security, of course, given the context of World War II, then we have economic cooperation, then we have human rights. But actually, I always say, and I used to say to my students back in my home country in Venezuela, what is the main reason behind the foundation of the UN is that it serves as a forum to discuss, to come together. And I recall what Hannah said about representation and what Mono said about, yes, it's with the people. So, I used to tell my students precisely that. It doesn't say with the heads of state and government, although people might see them during the high-level segment of the GA in September. It's with the people. So it's pretty much everybody. And it is a duty that we have, and the UN is not does not belong to an elite. It belongs to all of us. It's the representation of mankind. I have a follow-up question to all of you on that. Based on the current stage of where we are in the pandemic, I know there are many differences around the world in terms of rates and vaccination rates and so on, but to where we stand now, what role does the multilateral diplomacy in general and diplomats in particular, what role diplomats have to overcome the different challenges that have been posed by the pandemic? Jonathan, yes. I think Jonathan has some technical issues. Let's go with Hannah. Hannah, you have the floor.
I think Mona had her hand up first, but happy to take it anyway. Really, essentially, right now, it's very clear that nobody is safe until everyone's safe. So, of course, the priority for diplomats and for the international system is making sure that access to vaccines continues to be a priority, and that the education efforts and the ramping up of global health efforts in the sector overall continues to be a priority. From a technological perspective, I think there's a lot of potential and need to ramp up access on that side as well, in order to future-proof further megatrends that we're seeing moving forward. Please, Mona, over to you.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Omar. I think what we saw was actually a very, very low bar. We took the Security Council 4 months to even get a resolution out. And a lot of that was the bickering between two of the permanent members, which paralyzed the Security Council. So as a first step towards appropriate, credible, effective action is that the member states, and especially the permanent members of the Council, need to understand that they have a responsibility, an affirmative duty to act in the Charter, and not just a prerogative to act. That this is something that is required of them and, in a sense, demanded of them. They did it in response to the Ebola crisis rather well. They could have done it. They didn't do it this time. And the results are clear. We had a very delayed international response. The other thing is that it's not just the response. It's also the prevention of further consequences. Here, the General Assembly could have done more than the sort of high-minded recommendations that they adopted. There was very little in terms of immediate, practical, actionable measures adopted. A universal basic income could have been suggested or recommended. Immediate reporting or up-to-date reporting to the WHO. Compliance with WHO recommendations. So the Uniting for Peace mechanism could have given a little more teeth to what the General Assembly was doing, which was certainly far better than what the Security Council was doing. The General Assembly could have also asked the Secretary General to make recommendations to the Security Council to try to activate a little bit more robust activity to kind of put a proposal on the table before the Security Council under Article 99 or as a result of the GA action. Requesting the SG for such recommendation. So there is plenty that can be done within the existing mechanisms to be a more effective response to any threat to peace and security, including a global pandemic.
Thank you, Mona. Andres?
Thank you, Omar. I'll try to be brief and answer also the previous question. So why the UN is important? Actually, I think the UN is vital. When last year we went to quarantine, only in New York, only the essential workers were able to gladly to work in person. But we were saying among our colleagues, will that apply for UN delegates? And some of them say they won't buy that. But when you look that that's the moment when the world needed the most, the United Nations, is something that we should reconsider. What do we need to do as diplomats, as I understood your questions, more than as countries? As diplomats, what do we need to do? So yes, exactly. The United Nations is not an entelequia. The United Nations is human beings. Our countries are human beings. Our delegations are human beings. So what do we need to do as diplomats? I put this as a last paragraph of my chapter, and I offer this to you. If I knew, and it's not mine, it's from Montesquieu. If I knew of something that could serve my nation, but will reign another, I will not propose it to my prince, for I am first a man, and only then a Frenchman, because I am necessarily a man, and only accidentally am I French. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tony, I think you had your hand raised.
Yes, I did. I just want to, my colleagues have excellently responded to the question. I think, though, for diplomats in going forward, and each of my colleagues have focused on a particularly different perspective. I think, though, for them is how we communicate as diplomats here in New York back to our capitals on our role in engendering trust and hope. And where I see this, and always wearing my population hat, is how we can engender trust among youth, who for the first time in our history, we have the largest youth population. How do we get them on board and for them to be seen as the agents of change? We talk a lot about or planning for current and future populations, but the youth who are now current are going to be leading future generations in diplomacy, future generations in governance and development. And the future that we want is going to be dependent on how the youth see themselves in decision making and how they work together. As Andres said, I would not recommend something, even though it's good for my country, that it would be potentially harmful for another. So it's how we are going to train and to transition the new generation of diplomats to make decisions on the future that we want, which was clearly outlined in the UN 75 declaration. So I will just stop there.
Thank you very much, Tony. Jonathan, would you like to take the floor?
Thank you, Marlon. For that question, I think that the COVID-19 has shown us that beyond technicalities, it is possible to implement policies that overcome the systematic problems of the global economy. So I think that now we have to focus in the lessons that we learn in our negotiations and in our deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And actually, you step into my next question. My next question was precisely about, okay, we already know what happened, what is still happening around the world, and what the UN has done or failed to do, and the role of diplomats. But if there are lessons learned, are we prepared for a next pandemic or a next global challenge? What have we learned so far that can be useful for multilateral institutions, such as the UN system and the European Union, Organization of American States, and so on? What have we learned so far? Are we prepared for the next global challenge? Any one of you who would like to take the floor on that?
I'm happy to go if I may. But the short answer is no, Omar. We're not. But we certainly, what we try to do through this book is exactly that: tease out the lessons for the next global megatrend. And we've it's very, very clear that climate change and the need for climate action is not a future megatrend. It's a very current reality and a very current threat. We're looking at a reality where we were talking about a migrant crisis. The word crisis was used when there were about 3 million refugees moving within the Mediterranean region a couple of years ago. But with climate change, we're looking at the world's first environmental refugees by 2030 in the order of about 25 million people. And that statistic itself, of course, makes climate at the heart of the it should put climate at the heart of all policy matters, right? Not just environmental, but it becomes a political concern, a security concern, an economic concern. So I think think some of the lessons that we have, at least in terms of international cooperation, is the need for a functional, a strong, and a responsive and agile international system, right? One that fosters collective growth, one that fosters inclusion, one where agile governance is the norm, and certainly one that leverages the best potential of technology while mitigating some of its threats. So I think that a couple of the recommendations just to bring back is ensuring meaningful access to technologies, as well as innovation, research and development, international cooperation, and agility in our governance mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you. Tony?
Sure, just to add to that, and I think I did mention in my presentation that siloed approaches are insufficient. A very key recommendation. It requires now, as a global community, that we should be focusing on multidisciplinary approaches in our response. And the future really is, as we've all shared, we're looking at and we're dealing with multiple crises. And, when we talk about the issues of LDCs, LLDCs, SIDS, and middle-income countries, we're talking about countries that are facing multiple vulnerabilities. And in that regard, we have to begin to tailor how we approach sustainable development and our entire international architecture around how we treat with multiple vulnerabilities, how we manage uncertainties. Looking at these multiple crises, it's highly complex. And as a global community, we've not yet reached the point where we can manage the complexity of the crises that are natural and also human-induced.
Thank you. Before giving the floor to Mona, just to remind an audience that, for example, when we see the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, it's pretty obvious that, and we emphasize the fact that the goals are not isolated silos that we can see, separately, because of course, as we have always said that human rights are interrelated between them, that the same applies when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals. And within the UN system, there are tremendous efforts to fulfill the aspiration of enhancing and improve the coordination mechanisms, not only in the field, but at the headquarters level. So to have a unified response from the UN system. So this is an ongoing effort, I must say, that has been tested during the ongoing pandemic. Mona?
I think there's room for optimism in that we have the tools, we have the mechanisms, we have the lessons learned, we have the precedents. We also have a rather terrifying precedent following the pandemic 100 years ago. On the heels of a world war, with the kind of epiphany that we're now having, they had that same epiphany in 1918 and 1919 and worked to found the League of Nations. They then let that organization falter. They let that organization miss its mandate, miss its mission, miss its obligations that they had freely undertaken. And we were followed by a second, far deadlier world war with horrific Holocaust and other genocides. So we are the captain of our own ship as a human race, as our friend Andres Fiallo reminded us. We're all human beings, both the victims, the perpetrators, the leaders, the deciders. We're all human beings fundamentally, with hopes and fears and dreams and the ability to determine the course of human history. So will we choose the enlightened path, the one that has shown leads to survival, leads to protection of human rights and the dignity of and equality of human beings? Or will we choose the law of the jungle, the power of principles versus the principles of power, as I put it in my chapter? That choice is ours. It rests with us as a civil society to demand certain goals of our leaders, and it rests with the leaders in responding to that calling. It's not just for idealism. Like I said before, it's self-preservation. We've seen how any country that is allowed to run rampant with the pandemic creates new variants. And that new variant is going to come back and haunt even countries that have successfully controlled the pandemic or manifested a fantastic vaccine rollout. They are facing vulnerability because another country is not able to keep a lid on its surges and or lay out its vaccine rollout as effectively. So as many of us have said in our statements, we're not all safe until everyone is safe. We do not have a response to the global pandemic until every country has it under control. So it is in our very selfish interest to work together to overcome, whether it's the threat of the pandemic or the threat of global terrorism or the threat of genocide or any of these mass atrocity, mass death scenarios. It's in our interest as a matter of self-preservation to make it work.
Thank you, Mona. Since you raised the issue of what role civil society and organized civil society has, I was wondering if the distinguished panelists could answer me a question that what role institutions of higher education have now if we want to rethink multilateral diplomacy, which used to be understood as merely groups of states and states representatives coming together to discuss. We now understand that we need civil society, we need the private sector, like those companies making the vaccines, for example, just to make a concrete example. And again, we and by we I mean the United Nations Academic Impact, we might be a little bit biased because we relate exclusively with institutions of higher education. And we of course know that universities and colleges and research centers are critical to get to the actual advancement of the 2030 agenda. But how do you see the role of academia in multilateral diplomacy going forward? Mona, you have the floor.
I think the future hinges exactly on what you're talking about. The recognition of member states that the relevant actors are not only states. They remain the primary actor, but they're not the only relevant actor. And whether it's private sector or public sector, even within the public sector, there are other actors, non-state parties to the conflicts on the agenda of the Security Council, I think first and foremost, because the majority of the agenda is intrastate conflicts. And unless you hear from both sides or multiple sides, you do not have a chance in hell of solving these crises. The Charter foresees this by giving even non-members of the UN the right to be heard when a conflict affecting them or involving them is on the agenda. So that principle of fairness is coupled with a recognition, a very practical, self-serving recognition that resolving conflict requires hearing from the affected parties. So in fulfillment of that principle enshrined in the Charter, and albeit extending it to actors that are not named in the Charter, but to recognize the principle and the new realities that we have, coupled again with the digital technology that allows us to bring these actors in without actually inviting them into the room. So that concern about legitimizing certain actors or entitling certain actors can be solved through technology, that they're heard, they're seen without actually being physically in the room. So we've seen how conducive that is to enhancing the understanding of the very members who are making decisions. They make more informed decisions and therefore more likely to succeed decisions as a result of that opportunity to hear from those who are affected. The private sector is a very good example in the pandemic, but in normal conflict, it would be the non-state parties to the conflicts.
Indeed, and we remember that although it is not technically speaking in the UN Charter nor in the rules of procedure of the Security Council, we of course have the area formula, for example, that was envisioned by a fellow national of my own home country, a former diplomat. And he said in a very Venezuelan style, okay, if we cannot meet here, let's meet outside. So let's think outside of the box because we need to hear non-state actors for sure. Back in the days when the Security Council was discussing the situation in former Yugoslavia. Andres?
Thank you, Omar. And just to add that in the future, like in the present, when so we member states, we bring the problems but we need academia for the solutions. And this is illustrated also, for example, in my chapter. on peace and security, chapter 5, where I explained Spanish flu and then the impact of COVID now in 2020, 2021 in the field, in the UN system, etc. But then I provide some recommendations, and then I note that those recommendations are not comprehensive solutions. So that's why we have a special article from Sarah Cliff, who is from academia, from NYU specifically, and her recommendations on peace and security for the future are to the regular review of non-military international peace and security threats, also to anchor a game-changing shift in digital cooperation in relation to mediation and peace processes, and an ambitious partnership campaigns to halve global violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andres. And since we are running out of time, allow me to conclude with a couple of questions that have been raised by the audience through the chat box. In addition to that, for Tony and Hannah, there's someone from Friends of the Initiative at the World Youth for Climate Justice campaign that they want to be in touch with you. I think they provided their contact information there. Now, as for the questions, allow me to summarize both questions because they are related somehow. And it's about the sovereignty and how states perform in multilateral stages such as the UN. And so one question refers to what happens when there is no correlation between an international obligation assumed by state and what the state actually does at the domestic level. So what role multilateral diplomacy has in this regard? And we might think, for example, in the guidelines provided by the World Health Organization during the pandemic, and if the states are not compliant or not with those guidelines. And then there's another question about, countries that are acting far away from what this person calls diplomatic tradition. So I don't know if any one of you would like to take the floor on those two questions. Andres, you have the floor.
Thank you, Omar. Actually, I think I didn't lower my hand, but if our friend Hannah, I think she will have a better perspective on this answer.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Thank you, and that's a great question. I think this really comes to the heart of the question of stakeholder diplomacy and this idea of agile governance, right? So when the UN was when the Charter was first signed 76 years ago, and that's again why what we're celebrating this week. This was, just over a dozen states that came together and thought of how they could come up with joint solutions, or at least a platform for conversation as an alternative almost to the battlefield, right? Just put very simply and crudely. Whereas now, not only do we have 193 states, but we see relevant actors in all spaces. So we've mentioned the private sector, academia, nonprofits, etc. So the challenge really. And it also goes to the question of the roles that everyone has, is making sure that we are able to have an inclusive process, one that represents really the peoples in coming up with our governance mechanisms. And there are a couple of good examples of that. I think the Internet Governance Forum is an interesting one. Colleagues have also mentioned the means for participation. They've mentioned how through the pandemic, actually having virtual sessions has meant that some meetings are more public and more people from all over the world from different sectors are able to engage more. I think these are all very relevant engagements. And I think that the points made about youth action and youth engagement in decisions that will determine their future is absolutely fundamental. But the challenge here will be making sure that this isn't tokenistic. We'll be making sure that this is meaningful engagement, that it is representative engagement, and it's not just necessarily the loudest voices in the room, but that certainly that we're hearing with clarity, voices, and making decisions. And this is where, again, I think technology has a role to play. I think there's a lot that can be done through big data, through analyzing, to analyze great swaths of information, priorities, and imperatives moving forward, and that this can actually guide diplomacy, international public policy, if we find the right ways to do that. So that's something where, again, I think we can learn a lot from the private sector and kind of what people want, the future that we want and the UN that we need going towards its centennial, and I look forward to being a part of that future and to all of your contributions in that.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Mona, you have the floor.
Very quickly, I think there's a premise re-emerging in the international discourse because of the rise in populism and the rise in what I call extreme nationalism. There has been this kind of reintroduction of the idea that anything UN or multilateral is somehow a diminution of sovereignty or of the independence of states or of the self-interest of states. And that binary sort of understanding of the term sovereignty has to be corrected. We need to restore the sense that what's in the Charter and the appeal to multilateralism and the appeal of multilateralism is not a moral ideal by flower children that emerged seeking a better world. It was the world's greatest superpowers recognizing that the atrocities of World War II and the Holocaust cannot be repeated as a matter of human survival and of the ability to save the nation-state system. It is necessary to have what they call the enlightened self-interest to understand what it would take to survive the 20th and now the 21st century. That human rights violations are an early warning system of greater violation of the international legal order. That conflicts can escalate into world conflicts, that secret alliances can mushroom into global threats, that the genocide is a threat to all of mankind. Even if it's committed within the territory of one country, it is a threat that challenges the conscience of humanity. That certain weapons of mass destruction are a threat to all, even if possessed by a few. So these principles are not just moral ideals and universal values that are embraced by all, but they are in fact designed to save the world. Add to them what we have recognized in the 21st century, climate crisis, as well as global pandemic crisis, as two other sources of mass threat. So this kind of binary, kind of zero-sum game understanding of national sovereignty versus multilateralism, I think is an incorrect framing of the issue. We can protect sovereignty, we can protect the nation-state system by recognizing that cooperation towards these higher values, towards these universal values, can actually both preserve the national legal order as well as the international legal order.
Thank you, Mona. And I used to say to my students of international law precisely something along those lines, that sovereignty is not diminished by multilateral diplomacy, nor because of a membership in an international entity, but actually is reaffirmed because of it. So thank you very much for that. Before giving the floor to Jonathan, we have time for just one more question. A member of the audience asked how we can improve relationship between civil society organizations and missions or permanent missions to the UN in order to improve the work of the UN. So if any of the current or former members of their respective permanent missions would like to take the floor of that. Jonathan, would you like to do so?
Thank you, Mar. But relating with some elements that you mentioned before, I think that now is the time to make a compilation and analyze the effectiveness of some policies that we have taken in our countries, in the financial organizations. And after that, it will be important to have, for the international community, to have a forum for an inclusive dialogue. For example, in debt, the steps taken to address debt crisis in the context of the pandemic should be a starting point for discussions on more comprehensive options towards debt, sustainability, and the achievement of the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I'm sure that it was a very enlightening discussion for our audience and for ourselves. A word of from the UNAI side, we have two upcoming events. that you can see on our website, which is www.un.org/en/academic impact. We have a section there where you can see news from our members around the world. We have over 1,500 universities and colleges that are currently members of the UN Academic Impact, and we have a couple of events within the next few days and weeks. On 6th July, we have a side event co-organized with the University of Bergen in Norway, partnering to educate the ocean science leaders of the future. This is a side event within the framework of the HLPF, the high-level political forum that has been convened by the UN. And a few days after that, on 15th July, which is the World Youth Skills Day, we have another webinar called COVID-19 and Youth Employment, discussing the impact and opportunities derived from the pandemic to foster employment for youth. Once again, on behalf of the United Nations Academic Impact and the United Nations Secretariat, we would like to thank our distinguished panelists for the wonderful remarks here today with us, and to the audience for their registration and participation here. As a reminder, we will publish within the next few days and weeks a recap or summary of this discussion, along with the recording of the YouTube video on our YouTube channel for those of you who would like to rewatch the webinar and those that were not able to watch it live. Once again, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from New York. Thank you very much.